Hello guys, there's a new update in the Lynette Hooker case, and investigators now believe the ocean may not be where this story began. When Lynette Hooker disappeared from the catamaran Soulmate in the Bahamas, the explanation sounded almost too simple. A late-night dinghy emergency, darkness, open water. A woman suddenly gone somewhere off the coast near Hopetown, but within days investigators started finding details that changed the direction of the entire case. Evidence inside the boat, contradictions in the timeline statements that reportedly didn't stay consistent, and questions surrounding what was happening aboard Soulmate long before authorities were ever called. Then the investigation escalated, federal agents became involved. The vessel itself was seized, media attention exploded across the United States, and investigators began focusing less on the ocean and more on the people who were still on the boat after Lynette vanished, because according to investigators, some parts of the story simply didn't match the evidence. Tonight on Crimson Archive, we reconstruct the final known hours aboard Soulmate and examine the growing number of unanswered questions surrounding one of the Bahamas' most unsettling disappearance cases. As investigators continued reviewing the disappearance of Lynette Hooker, new attention began shifting toward details surrounding the timeline aboard Soulmate before she was ever reported missing. What initially appeared to be a tragic overboard accident was now being examined far more closely by investigators reviewing statements, communications, and the sequence of events leading up to the late-night emergency near Hopetown in the Bahamas. According to public reporting, authorities began identifying inconsistencies connected to the account given about the incident. Questions surrounding timing, movements aboard the catamaran, and the actions taken after Lynette disappeared started becoming a larger part of the investigation. And as those details surfaced publicly, the narrative surrounding the case slowly began to change. Lynette, her husband Brian Hooker, and Carly Ellsworth had all been aboard Soulmate during the voyage through the Bahamas. But investigators were no longer looking at the vessel as simply the last place Lynette had been seen alive. Increasingly, attention was turning toward what may have happened aboard the catamaran before authorities were ever contacted. Then investigators began comparing those details to the physical evidence found aboard the boat. During the night of February 2022, Soulmate was anchored near Elbow Cay in the Bahamas when, according to Brian Hooker, a problem involving the catamaran's dinghy suddenly unfolded in the dark waters outside the vessel. Brian later explained that the dinghy had drifted away from the boat during the late-night hours. According to his account, he and Lynette were attempting to deal with the situation when she somehow entered the water near the catamaran. The conditions that night reportedly made visibility difficult. The area surrounding Hopetown was dark, the water conditions were unpredictable, and aside from a few nearby vessels in the distance, there were no publicly confirmed witnesses to what happened in the moments before Lynette disappeared. Brian claimed he searched for her immediately but could not locate her in the water. Authorities in the Bahamas were later contacted, triggering a search effort involving local responders and maritime agencies, scanning the surrounding area for any sign of Lynette. Investigators reviewed currents, drift patterns, weather conditions, and the reported timeline surrounding the emergency as they worked to determine exactly what had happened near Soulmate that night. At first, the explanation sounded like a tragic accident at sea, but investigators soon discovered parts of the timeline that became difficult to explain. As search efforts continued in the waters surrounding Elbow Cay, investigators began shifting more of their attention toward the catamaran itself. Very quickly, Soulmate stopped being treated as only the last known location where Lynette Hooker had been seen alive. It became the center of the investigation. Authorities processed areas of the vessel while reconstructing the reported sequence of events surrounding the late-night dinghy incident. Because the catamaran functioned as both transportation and living space, investigators closely examined the interior layout, including sleeping quarters, walkways, deck access points, and confined movement areas aboard the boat. Then came the discovery that changed the direction of the case. According to public reporting, investigators located blood evidence connected to Lynette aboard Soulmate. That finding immediately raised new questions about whether the physical evidence matched the explanation investigators had originally been given about an accidental disappearance at sea. Investigators also reportedly examined concerns surrounding possible cleanup activity aboard the catamaran after Lynette vanished. Authorities worked to determine whether areas of the vessel had been cleaned before forensic processing was completed and whether any potential evidence may have been altered during the critical hours surrounding the incident. As forensic analysis expanded, investigators increasingly focused on comparing statements, movements, and physical evidence recovered aboard the vessel. The case stopped being about where Lynette disappeared and became about what happened aboard Soulmate before she vanished. Once investigators began focusing on Soulmate, their attention quickly turned to something just as important as the physical evidence. The timeline reconstructing the final hours before Lynette Hooker disappeared became one of the most critical parts of the investigation. Authorities reviewed the vessel's location, anchor position, and available navigation data in an effort to determine exactly where Soulmate was situated when the reported dinghy emergency occurred. Investigators also examined communication records, emergency contacts, and the sequence of events provided after Lynette was reported missing. At first, the timeline appeared straightforward, but the deeper investigators looked, the more questions emerged. They examined when the dinghy was first noticed missing, how long efforts to recover it lasted, what actions were taken aboard the catamaran afterward, and how much time passed before authorities were contacted. Each answer became part of a much larger reconstruction. Investigators also compared statements given at different stages of the case, looking for consistency in the reported sequence of events. As that process continued, areas of the timeline reportedly became increasingly difficult to reconcile with other information gathered during the investigation. The result was a narrowing window of scrutiny. Rather than examining an entire day, investigators began focusing on a much smaller period of time, the critical hours surrounding Lynette's disappearance. And as that window became smaller, the unanswered questions became larger. What happened during the hours investigators still cannot fully account for. As investigators narrowed their focus to the critical hours surrounding Lynette Hooker's disappearance, increasing attention turned toward the person who had provided the primary account of what happened that night, Brian Hooker. In the days and weeks that followed the incident, Brian participated in interviews and publicly described the events aboard Soulmate. He maintained that Lynette's disappearance stemmed from the late-night dinghy emergency and continued to characterize the incident as a tragic accident at sea. But by that point, investigators were already comparing those explanations against the growing body of evidence collected during the case. As authorities reviewed statements, timelines, communication records, and forensic findings, they began examining whether the details remained consistent across different accounts. Investigators were not focused on public opinion. Their attention remained fixed on evidence, chronology, and whether the reported sequence of events could be independently supported. Meanwhile, media coverage surrounding the case continued expanding. What had begun as a missing person investigation in the Bahamas was now attracting national attention. News reports, online discussions, and true crime coverage brought increasing scrutiny to the timeline, the evidence recovered from Soulmate, and the explanations surrounding Lynette's disappearance. Public suspicion grew alongside that attention, but investigators continued concentrating on one thing: inconsistencies. Because while search teams looked for Lynette, investigators were rechecking Brian Hooker's version of events. As investigators continued comparing evidence with the reported sequence of events, the case became increasingly focused on a growing list of inconsistencies that authorities believed required further examination. According to public reporting, investigators identified more than 24 discrepancies connected to the disappearance of Lynette Hooker. Some involved the timeline. Authorities scrutinized when the dinghy was first noticed missing, how events unfolded afterward, and whether the reported sequence remained consistent when compared against other information gathered during the investigation. Other questions centered on the dinghy incident itself. Investigators reviewed the circumstances surrounding the reported recovery attempt, the movements aboard Soulmate during the critical hours that followed, and whether the available evidence supported the account originally provided. Then there was the physical evidence. As forensic findings from the catamaran were compared against statements describing an accidental disappearance at sea, investigators worked to determine whether every piece of information fit together logically. The deeper they looked, the more questions emerged. The discrepancies mattered because even small differences can significantly affect a maritime investigation. Timelines influence search patterns, reported movements affect reconstruction efforts, and inconsistencies can determine where investigators focus their attention next. Individually, some questions might have appeared minor. Collectively, they became impossible to ignore. One inconsistency might be confusion. More than 24 forced investigators to look deeper. As questions surrounding the disappearance continued to grow, the investigation expanded far beyond the waters surrounding Hopetown. What had started as a missing person case in the Bahamas was now attracting national attention across the United States. Television networks, news outlets, and true crime communities began closely following developments in the case. The combination of a missing woman, a disappearing timeline, and mounting investigative questions transformed the story into one of the most widely discussed maritime investigations in recent memory. The case also drew attention from Beth Holloway, whose years of advocacy following the disappearance of her daughter, Natalie Holloway, made her a recognizable voice in high-profile missing person cases. Her public comments brought additional visibility to Lynette Hooker's disappearance and highlighted the challenges investigators often face when cases cross jurisdictions and international waters. Meanwhile, the investigation itself continued escalating. The Coast Guard Investigative Service became involved as authorities intensified their examination of the evidence. Eventually, Soulmate was seized and subjected to further forensic review, a move that signaled just how significant the vessel had become to the case. For investigators, the catamaran was no longer simply the place where Lynette had last been seen. It had become one of the most important pieces of evidence. The investigation was no longer centered on open water. It was centered on the boat itself. Despite years of investigation, one of the most difficult aspects of the Lynette Hooker case is how many questions remain unanswered. By this point, investigators had reviewed statements, examined forensic evidence, reconstructed timelines, and processed Soulmate as a critical piece of evidence. Yet several parts of the case have never been fully explained in public. Attention has also continued to surround Carly Ellsworth, who was aboard the catamaran during the Bahamas voyage. Because Soulmate was a confined environment with only a small number of people present during the critical period, investigators examined the accounts and movements of everyone connected to the vessel. But many details of those investigative findings have never been publicly released. That lack of disclosure has created lingering questions about the timeline itself. Investigators spent years attempting to determine whether every movement, communication, and reported event could be independently verified. Some portions of the chronology remain unclear to the public, while other investigative records have never been disclosed in full. The challenges of maritime investigations only add to the difficulty. Unlike cases on land, incidents at sea often involve limited witnesses, environmental obstacles, and evidence that can be difficult or impossible to recover. Even when investigators gather substantial information, gaps can remain, and that is where the case stands today. No complete public resolution, no universally accepted explanation, and no definitive account of what happened during the final hours aboard Soulmate. What truly happened aboard Soulmate that night? The disappearance of Lynette Hooker remains one of the most debated maritime investigations in recent years because the case continues to be defined by a combination of evidence, unanswered questions, and conflicting accounts. Investigators examined the timeline, reviewed communications, analyzed forensic findings aboard Soulmate, and compared those findings against the explanations provided about what happened that night near Elbow Cay. Along the way, the investigation evolved from a reported accident at sea into a far broader examination of events that may have occurred aboard the catamaran itself. The physical evidence became a major focus. So did the timeline, and as authorities worked to reconcile both, questions continued to emerge that have never been fully answered in public. Today, the investigation remains unresolved in the eyes of many observers. At the center of it all is Lynette Hooker, a woman who vanished during what appeared to be an ordinary voyage, and whose disappearance continues to generate scrutiny years later. The ocean may have hidden the answers, but investigators believe the story may have started long before Lynette ever entered the water. The investigation into Lynette Hooker's disappearance continues to raise questions, and we'd like to hear your thoughts. After reviewing the timeline, the evidence, and the inconsistencies investigators identified, what do you believe happened aboard Soulmate that night? Leave your theory in the comments below. If you enjoy evidence-based true crime investigations built around verified reporting, documented timelines, and ongoing development, subscribe to Crimson Archive and turn on notifications so you don't miss future cases and updates. And as always, thank you for watching.